Deadwood, Dakota Territory, winter. 1878. I don't need saving, Maeve shouted, clutching the stolen ledger to her chest as Ezekiel's confident grin vanished, realizing every dirty secret he'd ever buried was now in her hands. Vance stepped between them, his eyes cold as steel. Good, he said, because we didn't come here to save you. We came to stand beside you. But when Ezekiel's gunmen rode into the mountains through a deadly blizzard, would Maeve survive long enough to bring down the man who tried to sell her? Stay with me, because this unforgettable Western story is just beginning. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next adventure. The mud in Deadwood never dried. It just changed color depending on what got dumped into it. Today it was red at the edges, thin streaks running off from the butcher's stall down toward the trading post, mixing with the brown until nobody could tell the difference anymore. Maeve stood in the middle of the square with her hands folded in front of her stomach. She'd learned that trick years ago. Fold your hands there, and people stop staring at your waist so much. It never worked, but she did it anyway. Ezekiel walked a slow circle around her. He wore a black coat that fit too well for a man who claimed to be doing God's work out here on the frontier. His boots were clean. Nobody's boots were clean in Deadwood, not with this mud, but his were. Gentlemen, he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, I present to you a hardy specimen, 200 pounds of good frontier stock. A few men laughed. One spat Maeve kept her eyes on a spot past Ezekiel's shoulder, on a crooked sign nailed to the saloon that said dry goods in faded letters. She'd found that trick too. Find something boring, stare at it, let the words bounce off somewhere behind your ribs instead of landing. Now I'll be honest with you all, Ezekiel went on. She won't turn heads on a dance floor. But you don't need a dance floor out here. You need someone who can carry water, split wood, birth a calf if she has to. This one's built for it. Her family had said close to the same thing the day they put her on the coach east. Not unkindly. That was the strange part. Her mother had smoothed down her collar and said, You're not the kind men marry for love, Maeve. So best you find one who'll marry you for use. Practical advice, her mother called it. Maeve had nodded and said thank you, because there wasn't anything else to say to that. Ezekiel stopped in front of her now, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair. Speak up, girl. Tell them you can work. Maeve looked at him, really looked. For the first time since he'd pulled her off the coach, his eyes were doing math, not looking at a person, looking at a sum, weighing what she'd fetch against what she cost to feed. Something old and stubborn woke up in her chest, not the polite, folded hands version of her. The other one, the one her mother used to scold out of her before she was 10 years old. I can work, Maeve said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I can also read a ledger, keep accounts, and count faster than most men in this square. Which of those is worth more to you, Mr. Ezekiel? The lifting or the counting? A ripple went through the crowd. Somebody laughed, and this time it wasn't at her. Ezekiel's smile thinned out. She's got spirit, he said to the crowd, recovering fast. Spirit breaks easy, though, once she's fed and housed regular. Don't let it worry you. Gentlemen, he turned to gesture toward the ledger tucked under his arm, the one where he kept his real business written down, the shipments and the debts and the names of every woman who'd passed through his hands before her. And in that half-second, his attention slid off Maeve entirely. She'd been waiting for exactly that. Her hand moved before her mind caught up with it, quick and flat, the way she'd practiced 100 times back home lifting apples off a cart, without the vendor noticing. The ledger slid free of his arm and disappeared into the folds of her skirt. Ezekiel kept talking. He never felt a thing. It wasn't dignity that made her do it. Dignity was a luxury for women who got to eat first and decide things second. This was survival math, plain and simple. A man like Ezekiel didn't fear scripture or shame. He feared a paper trail. If she was going to be sold today, she'd rather walk away owning a piece of the man who sold her. From the shadow of the livery across the square, a man named Vance watched the whole thing happen. He hadn't meant to stop and watch. He'd come into town for rope and nails, nothing more. Still moving through the world, the careful way a soldier moves through unfamiliar ground even years after the war's ended. But something about the woman standing in the mud had caught his eye before Ezekiel ever opened his mouth. The set of her shoulders, squared, not slumped, even while the whole town looked at her like livestock. Then he'd seen her hand move, fast, clean. A soldier's kind of fast. The kind that comes from practicing something in private, until your body does it without asking your permission first. Vance had spent 6 years reading men in half a second, deciding who'd run and who'd fight before the first shot ever fired. He read her now the same way. And what he saw wasn't a broken woman waiting for someone to want her. He saw a survivor who'd learned to take what she needed because nobody was ever going to hand it to her. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself, more nights than he cared to count. "Callan," he said quietly, without turning his head. Bram, the 2 men came up beside him. Callan was already frowning at the scene in the square, his jaw tight the way it got whenever he watched somebody get talked down to. He built things for a living, cabinets and coffins and cradles alike, and maybe that was why cruelty always looked to him like something badly made, something with the joints all wrong. Bram didn't say anything. He just watched Ezekiel's mouth move, and his hands curled slow into fists at his sides, the way a man's hands do when his body's already decided something his brain hasn't caught up to yet. "That one," Vance said. Callan looked at him. The auctioneer's about to insult her into the ground. "You sure? She just picked his pocket in front of the whole town, and he doesn't even know it yet." Vance's mouth twitched, close to a smile, which for Vance was as good as a laugh. "That's not a woman who needs saving." "Callan, that's a woman who needs somebody willing to stand next to her while she does the saving herself." Bram grunted, which from Bram counted as agreement. They walked out into the square together, 3 men, and the crowd parted the way crowds do. For men who look like they've survived things other men haven't. Ezekiel's smile came back on fast when he saw them. "Gentlemen, come to bid on some fine frontier stock. We'll take the whole contract," Vance said, "whatever the winter gold's worth." All of it. The square went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold still a second. Maeve's chin came up. She looked at the 3 of them, one after the other. The tall one with the scar cutting through his eyebrow, standing like the ground under him, personally, owed him nothing. The one beside him with sawdust, still caught in the cuff of his sleeve, watching her the way a man watches something he's already decided to be careful with. And the big one at the back, quiet eyes locked on her like he was memorizing something. She didn't know what she'd expected. Pity, maybe. Men buying her out of some misguided charity. The kind that made you feel smaller instead of bigger. That wasn't what she saw in their faces. Ezekiel's eyes flicked toward the ledger under his arm, or rather, toward the empty space where the ledger used to be. And for one heartbeat, something like doubt crossed his face. He patted his side once, twice, and found nothing there. His eyes came up and found Maeve's. She held his gaze and didn't blink. He couldn't accuse her, without admitting he'd been robbed by the very woman he'd just called worthless in front of the whole town. Vance watched the whole exchange, watched something pass silently between the trafficker and the woman that he didn't understand yet, but filed away all the same, whatever it was. It belonged to her. He'd let her tell it in her own time, or not at all. "Winter gold," Ezekiel repeated, and greed did what it always does. It swallowed his suspicion whole. "Well, a deal's a deal. Gentlemen." The contract changed hands. Maeve stood there while 3 strangers paid a fortune for a life that had, until this exact minute, only ever been valued in pounds and labor. Vance stepped forward first. He didn't reach for her arm the way Ezekiel had, dragging her along like baggage. He stopped a respectful distance off and simply said, "You'll ride with us. Nobody's putting a hand on you unless you say they can." Maeve looked at him, then at Callan, then at Bram, who nodded once, slow and certain, like a man swearing an oath without needing the words for it. She didn't say thank you. Gratitude felt too small and too soft for what had just happened. Instead, she reached into the fold of her skirt, pulled out the stolen ledger, and held it against her chest like a shield. "I don't need saving," she said, "but I'll take the company." Vance's mouth curved, just slightly. "Good," he said, "because we weren't offering to save you. We were offering to walk beside somebody who already knows how." The trail out of Deadwood climbed fast, and the mud turned to ice within the first mile. Maeve had never worn boots built for this kind of cold. Her family had sent her west in a thin cotton dress and a coat that might have kept her warm in a mild autumn back home. Nothing more. She hadn't complained about it then. Complaining had never gotten her anywhere. She didn't complain now either, though her teeth had started chattering somewhere around the second switchback. Bram noticed first. He always noticed things before anyone said them out loud, the way hunters do, watching for the small signs instead of waiting for the shout. He pulled his mule up alongside her and held out the reins without a word. "I can walk," Maeve said. "Didn't say you couldn't." He kept holding the reins out, said you don't have to. She looked at the mule, then at him, trying to work out the trick in it. There wasn't one. He just stood there, patient as a fence post, waiting for her to take what he was offering. She took it. Kaylin up on her other side a minute later and unrolled a length of fleece from his pack, thick and soft, the kind of material you'd expect a man to save for something precious. He draped it over her shoulders without asking, tucking the edges in around her collar the way a father might bundle a child before sending them out into the snow. Except there was nothing childish in the way he did it. His hands moved careful and sure, like he'd measured the fabric against her shoulders in his head before he ever cut it. "You didn't have to do that either," Maeve said. "I know." Kellen stepped back, checking his work. "Figured I'd do it anyway." She pulled the fleece tighter and said nothing else. It was warmer already. She hated how much that surprised her. The climb kept going. Vance walked point, scouting the trail ahead the way he must have scouted 100 trails before this one, rifle slung easy across his back, eyes never quite settling in one place for long. He didn't talk much. Maeve had noticed that back in town, too, how he let his silence do most of the work, how the men around him seemed to read meaning into it anyway. By the third mile, her legs ached from the cold, not the walking, since she was riding, but from bracing against every gust that came howling down off the ridge. The mule stumbled once on a patch of ice, and she pitched forward, catching herself hard against its neck. She apologized to the animal, then to Bram, then to the trail in general, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm sorry. I know I'm slowing us down. I'll try to be lighter in the saddle." Vance stopped walking. He turned around slow, the wind whipping his collar up around his jaw, and looked at her the way he'd looked at her back in the square, weighing something, deciding something. "Say that again," he said. Maeve's cheeks went hot despite the cold. "I said I'm sorry for slowing everyone down. My weight. It's not exactly built for mountain trails, and I don't want to be a burden on." "Stop," he said it quiet, but it landed like a slammed door. "Up on this mountain, a person's worth isn't measured on a scale. You hear me? That body of yours carried you through a town that tried to sell you like cattle. It kept you standing, while a man told the whole square you were only good for lifting and hauling. It is a fortress, and a fortress doesn't apologize for taking up ground." The wind kept blowing. Nobody said anything for a second. Maeve looked down at her hands, gripping the reins too tight. She'd spent 24 years hearing the opposite of what Vance had just said, from her mother, from the boys back home who laughed behind their hands, from Ezekiel not 2 hours ago, in front of half the county. She didn't know what to do with the other version of it. It didn't fit anywhere in her yet. "You don't have to believe me today," Vance said, reading the silence on her face plain as a map. "But you'll hear it again tomorrow, and the day after, until it takes." He turned and kept walking. Bram fell in step beside the mule, and Kaylin walked close on her other side, and Maeve rode between the three of them up a mountain that didn't care one bit how much she weighed, only whether she could survive it. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dropped behind the ridge, and the whole world had gone the color of a bruise, purple and gray and cold clean through. The cabin itself sat tucked into a stand of pine, timber walls thick enough to hold against the wind. Smoke already curling up from a banked fire. One of them must have left burning that morning. Vance held the door for her. Kalen took the mule to the lean-to out back. Bram carried in the packs. 3 trips without complaint. Stacking them by the hearth it cost him nothing. Maeve stood just inside the door and looked around at the place that was apparently, as of today, supposed to be some version of home. A long table down the middle, furs stacked along one wall, a rifle rack, a workbench covered in half-finished carpentry, the smell of wood smoke and tallow and cold pine sap. She still had the ledger tucked inside her coat. She'd carried it the whole way up the mountain, pressed against her ribs under the fleece Kaelin had given her. And somewhere in those 6 miles of climbing, she'd made up her mind about something. She wasn't going to hand it over quietly and hope these 3 men turned out different from every other man who'd ever decided her fate for her. She was going to make sure, right now, before this went any further, that they understood exactly what kind of woman they'd just spent a winter's worth of gold on. She waited until all 3 of them were in the room. Vance banking the fire higher, Kalen setting a pot to heat, Bram leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her the way he'd watched her the whole ride up. Maeve pulled the ledger out from under her coat and set it down on the table, hard enough that the sound cracked through the quiet cabin like a gunshot. All 3 men turned. "Before we go any further," she said, "you should know what you bought." Vance's eyes went to the ledger, then to her face. "That's Ezekiel's book. It's mine now." She kept her hand flat on the cover. "It's got names in it. Women he's sold, men he's bribed, routes he's run girls through, since before I ever came off that coach. I took it off him in the square, while he was busy telling the whole town I was only fit for hauling water." Kalen's mouth opened slightly, Bram's arms uncrossed. "You picked his pocket," Vance said. It wasn't a question. There was something almost like approval buried under the flatness of his voice. "I did." Maeve straightened up as tall as she could manage, which wasn't very tall. "But it wasn't nothing either. And I'm telling you now, before you decide what kind of arrangement this is supposed to be, I'm not going to be a quiet, grateful thing that keeps house and says thank you for the roof over her head. I'll cook. I'll clean. I'll keep your accounts better than any of you keep them yourselves. I guarantee it. But I do that as a partner in this cabin, not as property you happen to win at auction. If that's not the deal you 3 had in mind, you can take me back down the mountain and I'll figure out something else." Silence again, longer this time. Bram was the one who broke it, and it came out as something close to a laugh, low and surprised. "She's got teeth. She's got a plan," Vance said. He walked around the table slow, studying the ledger without touching it, like he was giving her the choice of whether to let him. "This real thing, not a copy, not something he'd cook up to bait a trap. It's real. Names, dates, amounts paid to the marshal's office to look the other way." Maeve's voice didn't shake anymore. "He's been running women through this county for 2 years. Best I can tell from what I read on the ride-up." Vance looked at her a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He nodded, slow and deliberate. The kind of nod a man gives another man he's decided to trust with something important. "All right," he said. "All right, you want to be a partner in this, not a possession. Fine by me, fine by all of us. I'd wager." He glanced at Kalen, who was already nodding, and at Bram, whose grin had settled into something steadier, something closer to respect than surprise. "We didn't bring you up this mountain to put you on a shelf, Maeve. We brought you up here because a woman who can pick a trafficker's pocket in front of a whole town and walk away clean is exactly the kind of person worth having at your back." Kalen came around the table and looked down at the ledger, careful not to touch it without her say-so. "This could put Ezekiel away for good. If it's got names and payments in it, it could put a lot of men away," Maeve said, "marshals included. Some of them. Then we keep it safe," Vance said, "and we use it right when the time comes, not before. Ezekiel's not going to let a stolen ledger like that walk off without a fight. He'll come looking. Let him come." Bram said, and there wasn't a shred of worry in it. Maeve looked around the cabin one more time at the three men who'd just agreed, without much argument at all, to treat her like an equal instead of a burden. It didn't erase 24 years of her mother's practical advice. It didn't erase the square, or Ezekiel's voice calling her hardy stock in front of half the county. But it was a start, and a start was more than she'd expected to get out of this whole arrangement when the coach first pulled into Deadwood. Then I suppose we've got a winter to survive, she said, and a trafficker to bring down when the time's right. Vance almost smiled. Suppose we do. The first week settled into a rhythm none of them had planned out loud, but it took shape anyway, the way habits do when four people share close quarters and cold weather. Maeve took over the ledger of the cabin itself within 2 days. Not just Ezekiel's stolen one, but the household accounts. The tally of flour and salt and lamp oil. The count of furs waiting to be traded down in the spring. Vance had been keeping track of it in his head before. Rough numbers. Close enough for a man living alone in the wild. Maeve wrote it all down in neat columns and found, within an hour of looking it over, that they'd been shorted on their last trade by a supplier who assumed nobody up here could count past 20. We're owed $4, she announced at supper, sliding the account book across the table toward Vance. The trader in Spearfish undercounted your last hide delivery. Either he can't count, or he figured nobody up here would check. Vance looked at the numbers, then at her, something unreadable crossing his face. You're sure? I'm sure, she tapped the page. I checked it twice. He closed the book slow. Remind me not to let you near a card table. It was as close to a joke as she'd heard out of him yet, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it, though she didn't have a name for the feeling and didn't go looking for one. Kalen worked mostly at his bench, carving and joining, his hands never quite still. Maeve found herself watching him some evenings. The way he'd frown at a piece of wood, like it had personally offended him before he found the exact cut that fixed the problem. He didn't talk much either. Not the way Bram did. Easy and loud when the mood struck him. But Kalen's silence felt different from Vance's. Vance's silence was a wall, careful and guarded. Kalen's silence was more like a held breath, like he was always working something out before he let it become words. Bram brought in game nearly every day. Rabbit and grouse, and once a whole deer he'd dragged down off the ridge by himself. And every night he set part of the meat aside and cooked it his own way, seasoned heavy. Nothing like the plain fare Maeve had grown up on. He watched her eat that first plate with an intensity that made her nervous until she understood what he was actually watching for. He wasn't watching to judge how much she took. He was watching to make sure she took enough. Eat, he told her the second night, when she'd hesitated over a second helping. Cold like this, a body needs the fuel. Don't skimp on my account. She'd wanted to explain that skimping wasn't really about him. It was about 24 years of her mother, watching every bite that went past her lips, counting it against her, the way Maeve now counted flour sacks in the ledger. But explaining that felt like handing over a piece of herself she wasn't ready to hand over yet. So she just said thank you and took the second helping. It was on the fifth night that Ezekiel's name came up again, and the fragile new rhythm of the cabin cracked open a little. Vance had come in from checking the traps along the ridge, with news that didn't sit easy on his face. He set his rifle by the door and didn't say anything until he'd warmed his hands by the fire. Saw tracks, he said finally. 3 riders, maybe 4, coming up from the direction of Deadwood, then doubling back down before they hit the tree line proper. Scouting, Bram said. Not a question. Scouting, Vance's jaw tightened. Ezekiel's not the kind of man to write off a stolen ledger and $4 worth of embarrassment. He'll want it back, and he'll want to make an example while he's at it. Maeve felt the old cold creep back into her chest, the kind that had nothing to do with the weather. This is because of me, because I took the ledger. This is because of him, Kalen said, firm before Vance could answer. You didn't put those women's names in his book. You didn't take the bribes. You just refused to let him keep hiding it. That's a fine sentiment, but it won't stop bullets, Maeve said. and immediately regretted the sharpness in it, though nobody in the room seemed to mind. No, Vance agreed, but training will. Starting tomorrow, you learn how to hold a rifle steady, and you learn where to stand in this cabin if trouble comes through that door. I'm not raising you up this mountain just to have you standing helpless when Ezekiel's men show up looking for what's theirs. I've never fired a gun in my life, Maeve admitted. Then tomorrow's a good day to start, Bram said, and there was something almost eager in it, like the prospect of teaching her pleased him more than it should have, given the circumstances. She lay awake that night longer than usual, listening to the windwork at the timber walls, thinking about riders somewhere down below, picking their way through the dark, hunting for a ledger and a woman who'd embarrassed their boss in front of a whole town. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, underneath the fear, she found something that surprised her, a kind of steadiness. She had allies now, 3 of them, for the first time in her life. Whatever came up that mountain, she wasn't going to face it alone. The cold got worse before it got better, the way it always does in a mountain winter. And by the second week, Maeve's thin cotton dress had become more of a liability than a garment. The fleece Kaylin had given her helped, but it wasn't built to last through months of this, and everyone in the cabin knew it, even if nobody said so directly, until Kaylin brought it up himself one evening over supper. You need proper winter clothes, he said. A coat that'll actually hold against this cold, not just take the edge off it. I'll manage with what I've got, Maeve said, the old reflex kicking in before she could stop it. The instinct to take up as little space and require as little effort as possible. You'll freeze with what you've got, Kaylin said, not unkindly. I've got hides cured and ready. I can have you a coat inside a week if you'll let me take your measurements. Maeve went still. She knew what measuring meant. She'd had it done before. Back home, the town seamstress running a tape around her waist and hips, with a tight mouth and tighter eyes. Calling out numbers to her mother like she was reading off a ledger of failures. She remembered the heat that had crawled up her neck each time. Remembered wishing she could fold herself down small enough to disappear off the tape entirely. I can measure myself, she said. Just tell me where to hold the tape. Kaylin studied her a moment, and something in his face told her he understood more of what was sitting behind that offer than she wanted him to. But he didn't push. All right, whatever's easier. It wasn't easier. She spent an hour alone in the back room that night, tape in hand, trying to hold the measurements steady while her own hands shook, and every number that came back sounded in her mother's voice instead of her own. She gave up twice before she managed to write anything down, and even then, the numbers on the page looked like an accusation. She brought the paper out to Kaylin's workbench the next morning and set it down without meeting his eyes. He looked it over, frowning slightly, the way he frowned at wood grain that wasn't cooperating. These don't look right. They're right. Maeve, he said her name careful, like he was setting down something breakable. I build things for a living. I know when a set of numbers has been rushed through by somebody who didn't want to be doing the work in the first place. She didn't answer. Her jaw was tight, and she could feel her own pulse ticking away in her throat. I'm not trying to embarrass you, Kaylin said. I just want the coat to fit. That's all this is. That's all it ever is, Maeve said, and the words came out sharper and more bitter than she meant them to. That's what the seamstress back home always said, too. Just business, just numbers, hold still. And then she'd call them out loud enough for the whole shop to hear. And my mother would sigh like every inch was a personal disappointment to her. Kaylin set down the tape measure. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix it with a touch the way some men might have. He just waited, patient, the way he waited on a piece of wood to tell him what it wanted to become. I'm not your mother, he said, and I'm not the seamstress. I'm not measuring you to find out what's wrong. I'm measuring you so the coat sits right on your shoulders and doesn't pinch under your arms when you lift a rifle. That's the whole of it. Easy for you to say. Maybe. He picked the tape back up, slow, giving her every chance to stop him. You want to try again? I'll call the numbers quiet, just for the 2 of us to hear. Nobody else needs to know a single figure on that page. She hesitated a long moment. Then she nodded, because some part of her, worn down by the cold and the week's fear of riders in the tree line, wanted badly to believe him. He worked with a gentleness that surprised her, wrapping the tape around her waist without letting it dig in, calling the number low enough that it barely carried past the two of them, around her hips, her thighs, the width of her shoulders. Each number landed soft, matter of fact, no different from him measuring a plank of pine for a cabinet door. And still, halfway through, something in her chest gave way anyway, the old shame breaking loose from wherever she'd kept it locked down, and she felt her eyes go hot and her breath go ragged before she could stop either one. "I'm sorry," she said, pressing the heel of her hand against her eyes. "I don't know why You don't have to know why," Kane said. He set the tape down and knelt in front of her, the way a man kneels when he wants to be smaller than the moment, not bigger. He took her hand, the one not pressed against her face, and pressed his lips gently against the back of it. "You've spent your whole life being measured by people who used the numbers against you. Of course it's going to sting, having it done again, even by someone who means different by it." Behind her, Bram had come in from outside, drawn by the sound of her voice cracking, and he crossed the room slow and steady, the way he moved when he didn't want to spook something. He came up behind her and rested his hands lightly on her shoulders, not pulling her in, just letting her feel the weight and warmth of him there if she wanted it. "You're soft," he said low, the words rumbling out of him like something that had been sitting ready in his chest for days. "You are vital. You radiate warmth into every corner of this cabin. And don't think none of us have noticed it. Never ask a forest fire to shrink itself down small enough to fit into some tiny, cold hearth. That's not what you were built for." Maeve let out a breath that shook on the way out, but it felt different from the ones before it, lighter. Somehow, like something had been carried out of her chest along with the air. "That's a strange thing for a hunter to say," she managed. "Spend enough winters alone up here," Bram said, "and you learn to appreciate anything that puts out real heat." Kaelin still knelt in front of her, her hand still resting in his. "The coat'll be ready by week's end," he said, "and it'll fit, not because I shrank the numbers down to something easier to look at, but because I built it around the woman standing in front of me instead of the one everybody back home tried to talk you into being." Maeve looked between the two of them, Kaelin kneeling steady in front of her, Bram's broad hands still resting warm on her shoulders, and thought about how strange it was that a mountain cabin in the dead of winter had ended up being the first place in her whole life where somebody measured her and meant it as an act of care instead of an accusation. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words came out easy, without the old reflex of apology tangled up inside them. "Don't thank us yet," Kaelin said, standing, a faint smile finally breaking through the careful set of his face. "Wait till you see the coat, then thank us." Outside, the wind kept working at the timber walls, and somewhere down the mountain, riders were still combing the tree line for a ledger and a woman they intended to make an example of. But inside the cabin, for one evening at least, the cold didn't reach quite as far as it had the night before. Kaelin finished the coat 2 days ahead of his own promise, and when Maeve pulled it on for the first time, she stood still in the middle of the cabin for a long moment, running her hands down the sleeves like she couldn't quite believe the fit of it. It sat easy on her shoulders. It didn't pinch anywhere. The hem fell just past her hips, thick enough to hold against wind that had been finding its way through her old dress for 2 weeks straight. "Well," Bram said, looking her over from his spot by the fire, "guess you'll live through the winter after all." "High praise," Maeve said, but she was smiling when she said it, and the smile stayed on her face longer than she expected. She didn't get much more time to enjoy the coat before Vance called her outside. He'd cleared a stretch of ground behind the cabin, packed the snow down flat, and set up 3 bottles along a fallen log about 30 yards off. A rifle waited on a stump nearby, cleaned and loaded, the same Winchester, lever action he'd carried on the trail up from Deadwood. "Time to learn," he said. Maeve looked at the rifle like it might bite her. "I told you, I've never fired one. I know. That's why we're starting now. Before you need to know how. Vance picked up the rifle and held it out to her. Stock first. Take it. Get a feel for the weight before we worry about aiming at anything. She took it, and it was heavier than she expected. Colder, too, the metal biting through her gloves. She held it the way she imagined a person should, arms out stiff, and Vance actually laughed, short and surprised, like the sound had gotten away from him before he could stop it. You're not hugging a log. Bring it in. Stock against your shoulder. Tight, right here. He stepped behind her, close but not touching, and guided her arms with his voice alone, correcting the angle of her elbow, the set of her feet. Plant your weight. Don't stand like you're ready to run. Stand like you belong exactly where you're standing. She adjusted her stance, feet wider apart, weight settled low. Something about the position felt oddly familiar, though she couldn't place why, until Bram wandered over from the woodpile to watch and said it plain. You've got good bones for this, he said. Low center, steady base. Half the men I've taught to shoot spend a year learning to stand like that. You're doing it without even trying. Maeve frowned, not understanding at first. What do you mean? I mean your build. Bram said it simple. No weight to it. The way he'd say the sky was gray, or the wind was picking up. Heavier frame, low in the hips. Makes for a steadier base than most string bean fellas I've trained. You're not going to get knocked backward by a little recoil. Vance stepped back to give her room. Try it. Sight down the barrel. Line the bead up on the middle bottle. And squeeze slow. Don't yank the trigger. Squeeze it like you're easing a door shut. Maeve lined up the shot the best she could, her hands trembling slightly with nerves rather than cold now, and squeezed. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the sound cracking out across the clearing loud enough to send a pair of birds scattering out of the pines. She flinched, braced for the fall she expected. The stumble backward she'd seen happen to men, twice her size in stories her father used to tell. It didn't come. She rocked back on her heels, caught herself easy, and stayed upright. The bottle on the logs stayed standing too, untouched, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw Bram grinning like she'd hit dead center anyway. Missed it by a mile, she said. Missed the bottle, Vance agreed. Didn't miss the point of the lesson, which is, you didn't go down. He nodded at her stance, still solid, still squared to the log. Most folks, first time firing a rifle like that, especially somebody your size, they figure the recoil's gonna send them sprawling. It doesn't work that way. Not with you. Your weight's not a weakness up here. It's an anchor. Maeve looked down at herself, then at the rifle still warm in her hands, turning the idea over slow, testing it for the trap she half expected to find hiding inside it. She'd spent her whole life hearing her size discussed as a problem to manage, a burden to apologize for, a thing that made her slower and softer and less than whatever the ideal was supposed to be. Nobody had ever once suggested it might make her harder to knock down. Again, Vance said. She fired 6 more times before the light started fading, and by the 4th shot, she'd clipped the edge of the middle bottle, sending it spinning off the log into the snow. By the 6th, she'd taken the second one clean off its perch, and Bram let out a whoop loud enough to carry halfway down the mountain. That's my girl, he said, and then seemed to catch himself on the word, glancing at Vance like he expected some kind of correction. Vance didn't offer one. He just watched Maeve reload with hands that had already stopped shaking, and something in his face settled into quiet approval. Tomorrow we work on speed, he said. Today, that's enough. You did good. Maeve handed the rifle back, and for the first time since Deadwood, she didn't feel the old urge to shrink herself down at the compliment, to wave it off or find some reason it didn't count. She just said, thank you, and let it sit there between them, plain and true. The lessons continued over the following days. Rifle work, in the mornings when the weather allowed it. Tactical drills with Vance in the afternoons, running through what to do if riders came up the trail while the men were out checking traps, where to position herself in the cabin, which windows gave a clean line of sight and which ones left a person exposed. You're a fast study, Vance told her. The 4th or 5th session in, watching her drop into position behind the overturned table they used as cover during drills. I've had practice learning things quick, Maeve said. Back home, you learn to read a room fast, or you paid for it. Same thing here, I figure. Just with a rifle instead of a raised eyebrow. Vance studied her a moment, like he was turning that thought over and finding more truth in it than he expected. Ezekiel's men are going to come up here, thinking they're dealing with somebody helpless, a woman they bought and paid for. Easy pickings once they get past the three of us. They'd be wrong. They'd be wrong, he agreed. And that's going to be the thing that saves your life when it comes down to it, not the rifle alone. The fact that they'll underestimate you walking in the door, same as Ezekiel did in the square. Let them keep thinking that as long as you can. It's the sharpest weapon you've got. Maeve thought about that during supper that night, turning the words over while Kaelin mended a strap by the fire and Bram cleaned the rifles at the table. She thought about her mother's voice, the seamstress's tight mouth, Ezekiel calling her hardy stock in front of half the county. All of them so certain her size made her less capable, less worthy, less everything. And she thought about the recoil of the Winchester, the way her body had held its ground when the men who trained her expected it to. Maybe every insult she'd carried up this mountain had been building toward exactly this. A body built to stand its ground when the world tried to knock it down. The waiting was its own kind of hard. Vance kept watch on the ridge most days now. Tracking sign, reading the weather for whatever advantage it might offer. An enemy still scouting the tree line. Ezekiel's men hadn't shown themselves outright since that first set of tracks, but they hadn't left either. Bram found fresh boot prints twice more along the lower trail, and once, a cold campfire tucked into a hollow half a mile from the cabin. Ash gone gray and brittle. Whoever built it long since moved on. They're circling, Vance said one evening, laying it out plain over supper, waiting for us to get comfortable, waiting for one of us to slip. So we don't slip, Kaelin said. So we don't slip, Vance agreed. But waiting wears a person down, same as fighting does. Just slower. He was right about that. Maeve felt it most at night, lying awake, listening to the wind test the timber, imagining every creak of the cabin as a boot on the porch, every gust as a hand testing the door latch. She'd wake exhausted some mornings, more tired than the day before. And she wasn't the only one. She caught Kaelin rubbing at his eyes over breakfast more than once, saw the tight set of Bram's jaw when he came back from checking the traps a little too fast, a little too watchful. It was Vance who suggested, without quite saying so directly, that the waiting needed something to counterbalance it, some ordinary comfort to keep the whole cabin from fraying at the edges. He started bringing his bedroll closer to the hearth in the evenings instead of retreating to his usual corner, sitting near enough that Maeve could feel the warmth coming off him while she worked through the household accounts by lamplight. You don't have to keep me company, she told him one night, only half meaning it. Wasn't planning on leaving you to do sums alone while the rest of us warm ourselves by the fire, Vance said. Besides, I like watching you work. You get a look on your face like the numbers personally owe you an explanation. Maeve laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, startled out of her. They usually do. Someone always thinks nobody's checking, and you always catch it, always. He watched her a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, and something passed between them that Maeve didn't have a name for yet, warm and unfamiliar. Nothing like the careful distance men back home had always kept from a woman built like her. Vance had never once treated her like she was too much to look at directly. Kaelin's attention came in smaller, steadier doses. He started leaving things for her without announcement. A second blanket folded at the foot of her cot, a mended seam on her coat, before she'd even noticed the tear. A cup of something hot set beside her elbow while she worked, always without comment. Always gone by the time she looked up to thank him. It took her the better part of a week to understand that this was simply how Kaelin loved, quiet and constant, care delivered in acts rather than declarations. You don't have to keep doing all this, she told him once, holding up the mended coat. I know, Kaelin said. The same two words Bram had used with the mule reins back on the trail. And she was starting to understand that this was a kind of answer all its own. A refusal to be talked out of kindness just because it wasn't strictly required. Bram's attention was the loudest of the three, though never overwhelming. He teased her over supper, coaxed real laughter out of her more often than the other two combined, found excuses to walk close beside her when they crossed the yard together, his hand hovering near the small of her back without ever quite landing there unless she leaned into it first. He was possessive in a way that should have unsettled her, and somehow didn't, watchful whenever another man's name came up in conversation, quick to stand a little taller whenever Vance gave her a compliment, like some old instinct in him wanted credit for noticing her worth first, even if he never said so outright. "You're staring," she told him one evening, catching him watching her across the table for the third time that meal. Bram didn't look away, didn't have the decency to seem caught, didn't realize it was against the rules. "It's not against the rules. It's just distracting." "Good," Bram said, and went back to his supper like that, settled the matter entirely. She found herself thinking about all three of them more than she meant to, turning the shape of the last weeks over in her mind while she lay awake, listening for boots that never came. Vance's steady watching, the way he made her feel capable instead of fragile. Kellen's quiet acts of care, each one a small rebuilding of trust she hadn't realized she'd need rebuilt. Bram's open, unhidden want, plain as the fire in the hearth, warming her whether she reached toward it or not. She hadn't set out to fall for any one of them, let alone all three. It happened the way most true things happen, slow and then sudden, built up out of 100 small moments rather than one grand gesture. A hand offered on an icy trail, a coat that fit because someone had cared enough to measure her right, a rifle that didn't knock her down, and a man who'd made sure she knew what that meant about her. "I never expected this," she admitted to Kalen one night, the two of them alone by the fire while Vance took first watch and Bram slept off an early morning of hunting. Expected what? Any of it. "I came up this mountain thinking I'd traded one kind of ownership for another, just dressed up nicer. Didn't expect to find three men who'd rather build me a coat and teach me to shoot than tell me what I'm allowed to want." Kiss set down the strap he'd been working, considering that a long moment. "None of us are looking to own anything, Maeve." Vance spent 6 years taking orders he didn't believe in. Bram grew up watching his own father treat his mother like property, and it about broke something in him permanent. "I build things for a living because I like watching something come together, right, piece by piece. Nothing forced into a shape it don't fit. We're not interested in owning a person. We're interested in one standing beside us as an equal." "That's a rare thing to find in one man," Maeve said. "Rarer still to find it in three." "Maybe," Kalen said. "Or maybe it's just what happens when three men who've each been broken a little different way find somebody who understands what putting the pieces back together actually looks like." Outside, the wind kept working at the mountain, and somewhere beyond the tree line, Ezekiel's men were still circling, still waiting for their chance. But inside the cabin, something had settled that hadn't been there in Maeve's whole life before this winter. A sense of standing inside a shield wall, built not out of obligation, but out of choice. 4 people bracing together against whatever the cold and the coming fight still had waiting for them. She fell asleep that night to the sound of Vance's quiet footsteps on watch outside, Bram's steady breathing across the room, Kalen's hands finally still after a long day's work, and found, for the first time since the coach first rolled into Deadwood, that she wasn't afraid of what morning might bring. The attack came the way Vance always said it would. Not at dawn, when a body's guard runs highest, in the dead hush of a blizzard, when the wind was loud enough to swallow the sound of men moving through snow, and the cold had everyone half convinced no sane person would be out in it at all. Maeve woke to Vance's hand on her shoulder. Gentle, but urgent. No room for argument in it. "Get to the corner," he said. Low now. She didn't ask questions. 3 weeks of drills had burned the response into her body, faster than thought could slow it down. She rolled off her cot and moved to the spot behind the overturned table they'd rehearsed a dozen times, rifle already in her hands before she'd fully registered picking it up. The first window shattered a heartbeat later. Glass sprayed across the floorboards, and wind screamed through the gap, carrying snow in sideways sheets. A shot cracked somewhere out in the dark, splintering the doorframe an inch from where Bram had been standing a second, before he dropped low and rolled clear. 4 of them, maybe 5. Vance called out, already at the second window, rifle braced on the sill. Ezekiel sent more than scouts this time. Kalen was up too, moving fast and low across the cabin, kicking the lamp out before it could silhouette any of them against the light. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by muzzle flashes and the pale gray wash of snowlight through the broken window. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands stayed steady on the rifle, the weight of it familiar now, an extension of her own arms instead of a foreign thing she had to fight to control. She thought of Vance's voice from that first lesson. Plant your weight. Don't stand like you're ready to run. She planted her weight. A shape moved past the broken window, dark against the snow, and she caught the shine of a rifle barrel, swinging around toward the corner where Bram had taken position. She didn't think. She fired. The shape dropped. Got one, she called out, her own voice sounding strange to her. Flat and clear in a way it hadn't been in the practice yard. Then get another. Bram shot back, already reloading. Something fierce and proud cutting through the grit in his voice, even in the middle of chaos. The fight tore through the cabin in pieces after that, loud and fast and ugly. Nothing like the clean drills they'd run in the yard. Wood splintered along the doorframe as a second man tried to force his way through, and Vance met him there, hand to hand in the dark, the two of them grappling, until Vance drove the man back out into the snow with a force that ended the fight before it properly started. A bullet caught Vance across the shoulder as he turned back toward the room, tearing through his coat and grazing deep enough to draw blood, dark against the pale fabric. He didn't go down. He barely slowed, pressing his good hand against the wound and keeping his rifle up with the other, jaw set hard against the pain. Vance. Maeve's voice cracked with the fear of it, but he waved her off before she could leave her position. Stay put. It's shallow. Watch your line. She watched her line. The third attacker came around the side of the cabin, using the blizzard for cover the way a smart man would, angling toward the spot where Bram crouched reloading. Half a second of vulnerability that a trained killer would know exactly how to exploit. Maeve saw him before Bram did, saw the barrel come up, saw the half second that separated a warning shout from being too late. She didn't shout. There wasn't time. She planted her feet wide, rested the Winchester against the shattered windowsill the way Vance had drilled into her a dozen times over, sighted down the barrel with hands that had gone perfectly, terrifyingly still, and squeezed the trigger the way she'd learned. Slow, like easing a door shut. The recoil kicked back hard against her shoulder. She didn't stumble. She stayed exactly where she stood, weight anchored low, and watched the attacker drop into the snow 10 feet from where Bram knelt. Oblivious to how close the moment had come, the cabin went quiet, save for the wind and the ragged breathing of everyone still standing inside it. Fourth one, Vance called out, still pressed against the doorframe, scanning the tree line. Anyone see a fourth? A long moment passed. Snow hissed against the broken window. Then, from somewhere down the slope, the distant sound of a horse crashing through brush, moving fast, moving away. Running, Kellen said, lowering his rifle slightly, though he didn't relax the set of his shoulders. One left, and he's running for it. Let him run, Vance said. He'll carry word back to Ezekiel that this cabin isn't the easy mark he figured it for. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the wind still working through the shattered window. Maeve stood frozen behind the overturned table, the rifle still warm in her hands, staring out at the shape in the snow that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. A man she'd killed, with her own hands, her own steady breath, her own choice to squeeze the trigger instead of freezing up. Her whole body started shaking then, all at once. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight draining out and leaving something colder and shakier in its place. Kaylin was at her side first, easing the rifle gently out of her locked hands. You did what needed doing. He was a heartbeat from putting a bullet in Bram. I know, Maeve managed, though her voice didn't sound like her own. I know that. It doesn't make my hands stop shaking. It's not supposed to, Vance said, crossing the room slow, favoring his wounded shoulder. First time taking a life sits heavy on anybody worth their salt. Means you're not a monster about it. Means you're still exactly the kind of person this cabin needs. Bram came in from checking the yard, snow crusted thick on his shoulders, and crossed straight to Maeve without hesitation, pulling her against his chest without asking permission first. And for once, she didn't have it in her to protest the assumption. She let herself be held, shaking hard against him, while the wind screamed outside and the cabin's shattered window let the storm pour in unchecked. You saved my life tonight, Bram said into her hair, his voice rough. Don't you forget that part, whatever else your head's telling you right now. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the cold pouring through the shattered window. And it took the three men working fast and grim to understand the shape of the problem now facing them. Two windows broken, the doorframe cracked where Vance had driven a man back into the snow, the fire in the hearth burning low, and no way to seal the cabin against a blizzard determined to claw its way inside every gap it could find. We can't hold heat in a room this open, Vance said, pressing a strip of cloth against his shoulder while Kaylin worked fast to bind it. Not through a night like this. The corner, Kaylin said, nodding toward the space by the hearth, the one wall still fully intact, furthest from both broken windows. Pull every fur we've got. Get the fire built up close as we can manage. Body heat's going to matter more than the fire itself before this night's through. Nobody argued the point. Hypothermia didn't care about pride, and every one of them had seen enough of it, in one form or another, to know exactly how fast the cold could take a person who thought they still had time to spare. They dragged the furs into the tight space by the hearth, stacking them thick against the floor and the wall, building a kind of nest out of everything soft the cabin had to offer. The fire, built up as high as the remaining wood allowed, threw long shadows across the timber, warm light, fighting a losing battle against the wind, still finding its way through the shattered glass. Maeve sat pressed into the corner first, still trembling, the adrenaline crash leaving her drained and cold in a way that had nothing left to do with the temperature of the room. Vance eased himself down beside her, favoring his injured shoulder, and Kaylin took the other side, with Bram settling in close at her back. The four of them packed tight into a space built for two at most. Nobody spoke for a long while. The fire crackled. The wind howled, somewhere out past the broken window. The last of Ezekiel's men was riding hard for lower ground, carrying word of a cabin that had cost him 3 friends and taught him a lesson about underestimating who lived inside it. Maeve's shaking hadn't fully stopped. Some of it was cold, honest, and simple. The kind that came from a night spent too close to shattered glass and howling wind. Some of it was something else entirely. The echo of a trigger squeezed and a life ended. The strange, hollow feeling of having done something necessary and unbearable in the same breath. Bram's arm came around her from behind, careful of Vance's wounded shoulder on her other side, and he pulled her back gently against the solid warmth of his chest. Kaylin took her hand, wrapping both of his around it, working slow warmth back into fingers that had gone stiff and pale. Vance, despite the wound, shifted closer too, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her side, an anchor in the dark. She had spent her whole life being told that a body like hers took up too much room, asked for too much space, demanded accommodations nobody else should have to make. Tonight, wedged into the small, warm center of 3 men who'd fought and bled to keep her standing. Her size wasn't an inconvenience to be managed. It was the very thing holding the cold at bay, the source of warmth radiating outward into the freezing dark. The reason all 3 of them had gathered close instead of huddling somewhere else. You're not shaking from the cold anymore, Vance said quietly, close to her ear. Not all of it. Anyway, no, Maeve admitted. I keep seeing him, the man I shot. I keep thinking about how easy it was, in the moment, and how much harder it feels now that the moment's over. That's the honest cost of it, Vance said. Anybody who tells you it gets easy isn't somebody worth listening to. But you did right by all of us tonight. Bram's alive because you didn't hesitate when it counted. I know that. Knowing it and feeling steady about it are two different things. Give it time, Kaylin said, still working warmth into her hand. Tonight, you don't have to feel steady about anything. Just let yourself be here. Let yourself be warm. Slowly, held between them, the shaking began to ease. The fire settled into a low, steady burn. The wind outside kept up its assault against the timber walls. But inside the small circle they'd built, the cold couldn't reach as far as it wanted to. Vance shifted, careful of his shoulder, and his hand came to rest along the curve of her hip, warm even through the layers of fur and clothing between them. His breath, when he spoke again, carried close and low against her ear, a different register than the flat command voice he used out in the yard. Look at us, he said, something wry and warm threading through the words. It's so tight in here. Beside her, Kaylin huffed out something close to a laugh, and behind her, Bram's chest shook with quiet amusement, both of them echoing the sentiment low and reverent, the kind of laughter that comes when danger's finally past and a person's allowed to feel something other than fear again. The words landed different than their plain meaning suggested. Tight, yes. The four of them crowded into a space meant for far fewer people. But there was another shape to it, too. Something in the press of shoulders and the warmth passing between them. Something none of them rushed to name outright. Content instead, to let the fire and the closeness say what words might have made too small. Maeve felt the fear of the night finally loosen its grip, replaced by something steadier. Something that had been building slow across every measured coat and every steady rifle lesson and every quiet act of care since the day they'd walked into that square in Deadwood and refused to see her the way the rest of the town did. She didn't feel too big for the space they'd built around her. For the first time in her whole life, she felt like exactly the right size for it, the center that everything else had gathered around, warm and solid and entirely, finally, at home. Outside, the storm raged on through the long hours of the night. Inside, wrapped close in furs and firelight, the four of them stayed pressed together until dawn, the fear of the fight slowly giving way to something gentler, something built on trust hard-won across 3 weeks of measured kindness and steady lessons. When morning finally broke pale and clean over the ridge, it found them still tangled together in the corner, the storm outside spent, the one inside finally, quietly, at peace. Morning came in gray and still. The storm finally spent. Snow piled thick against the shattered windows and drifted halfway up the door. Vance was the first one moving, easing himself up out of the nest of furs despite the stiffness in his bandaged shoulder, crossing the cabin to survey the damage in the flat light of dawn. It looked worse in daylight than it had in the dark. Both windows gone entirely, just jagged frames now. Snow drifted across the floorboards in a fan shape where the wind had been driving it all night. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Blood, dark and frozen, marked the boards near the threshold where Vance had fought off the second attacker. Outside, past the tree line, 3 shapes lay still in the snow, already half buried by the storm. Nobody in the cabin needed telling what they were. Kaelin stirred next, then Bram, and last of all Maeve, waking slow and stiff from a night spent curled tight against 3 bodies that had kept the worst of the cold at bay. She sat up and looked around the ruined cabin, at the snow drifted across the floor. At Vance standing in the doorway, with his rifle in hand and his shoulder wrapped tight, and felt something settle in her that hadn't been there before last night. Not fear, something steadier. We should bury them, she said, nodding toward the shapes, past the tree line. We should, Vance agreed. But there's something needs doing before that. Something that matters more. He looked at her, and she understood without him needing to spell it out. The ledger. It had sat wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her pack the whole night, forgotten in the chaos of the attack. safe through the worst of the storm by simple luck as much as anything. Maeve retrieved it now, the leather cover cold and stiff, and set it on the table among the wreckage of the cabin's interior. Ezekiel's not going to stop, Kalen said, checking the bandage on Vance's shoulder with careful hands. Last night proved that plain enough. He'll keep sending men until either he gets this book back or we're all dead, trying to keep it from him. Then we don't wait for him to send more, Maeve said. We take it to the marshals ourselves. Today, before he has time to regroup and try again. Vance considered that, weighing it the way he weighed everything. Slow and careful, looking for the trap hidden in a plan before he committed to it. The nearest marshal's office is 2 days' ride, through weather that just tried to kill all 4 of us. And every day we wait is a day Ezekiel gets to plan his next move instead of us planning ours. Maeve countered. We have the advantage right now, if we're fast about it. He thinks his men are still up here scouting, or dead. Either way, he doesn't know we're coming. Bram grinned, wolfish and pleased. The look of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of plan. She's got a point. Man like Ezekiel does his best work when he thinks he's holding all the cards. Time we took a few of those cards away. Vance looked around the ruined cabin one more time, at the broken windows and the crooked door, at the blood in the snow past the tree line, and made his decision the way he made all his decisions. Fast once the weighing was done. We ride at first light tomorrow, he said. Today we fix what we can here, rest, and get this shoulder properly stitched instead of just wrapped. Tomorrow, we take that ledger down the mountain and we end this. They spent the day patching what damage they could, boarding over the broken windows with spare lumber from Kalen's workbench, resetting the door on its hinge, tending Vance's wound properly with Maeve assisting, her hands steady despite the grim work of it, having learned enough in 3 weeks of household management to know her way around a needle and thread, even when the fabric in question was a man's torn shoulder. You've got a surgeon's hands, Vance said through gritted teeth as she worked the final stitch closed. I've got a lot of hands, apparently, Maeve said. Bookkeeper's hands, seamstress hands, sharpshooter's hands. Turns out a person can hold more than one thing at once, if somebody bothers to teach her instead of deciding ahead of time what she's capable of. Vance managed something close to a smile despite the pain. Turns out, they rode out the following morning, all 4 of them. The ledger wrapped tight and secure in Maeve's pack. The trail down the mountain slower going than the climb up had been. Weeks earlier, thanks to fresh snow and Vance favoring his stitched shoulder. But they made it, by the second evening, to the county seat, a town twice the size of Deadwood, with an actual marshal's office and, more importantly, a marshal that Ezekiel hadn't yet managed to buy off. Marshal Higgins was a broad, weathered man with a mustache gone mostly gray, and he listened without interruption as Vance laid out the whole account. From Maeve's humiliation in the Deadwood Square, through the theft of the ledger, to the attack on the cabin, 2 nights passed. When Vance finished, Higgins reached for the ledger himself, paging through it slow, his expression growing darker with every entry he read. Well, he said finally, closing the book, this is a hell of a thing to bring me. Names, dates, payments to men I'd have sworn were honest. He looked up at Maeve directly. You're the one took this off him. I am ballsy thing to do. Girl, pardon my language, especially given what he was calling you at the time. From what I hear, he called me worthless in front of half of Deadwood, Maeve said, meeting the marshal's eyes without flinching. Turns out, worthless women make excellent pickpockets when a man's too busy insulting them to keep proper track of his own ledger. Higgins let out a short, surprised laugh, then sobered fast, tapping the cover of the book. This is enough to bring federal marshals into it, given the scope of what's written here. I'll need you 4 to stay in town a few days. Give formal statements. Maybe testify if it comes to that. Can you manage it? We can manage it, Vance said. It took 4 days for the wheels to turn. 4 days of statements and waiting and watching Marshal Higgins coordinate with riders sent out to alert federal authorities in the territory capital. On the 5th day, word came back that a posse of federal marshals had ridden into Deadwood at dawn and taken Ezekiel into custody without a shot fired. The man too stunned by the sudden appearance of real law to put up much of a fight. He's asking to see the woman who did this to him. Higgins reported that evening, finding the four of them at the boarding house where they'd been staying. Says he wants to look her in the eye before they take him off to trial. Maeve considered that a long moment. Part of her wanted badly to refuse, to deny him even that small satisfaction of her presence, but a larger part of her, the part that had grown steadier with every week on that mountain, decided there was something worth doing in facing him one final time, not for his sake, but for her own. "I'll go," she said, "but I'm not going alone." She didn't need to say who she meant. All three of them were already reaching for their coats. The county jail was a squat brick building at the edge of town, and Ezekiel sat behind iron bars in a cell no bigger than a horse stall, his fine black coat gone, replaced by rough gray wool, his pomaded hair now flat and unkempt. He looked smaller than he had in the square that day, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the height of him and everything to do with the absence of power he'd once wielded so easily. He looked up when Maeve entered, flanked by Vance, Kalen, and Bram, and something bitter twisted across his face. "So," he said, "the hardy specimen returns. Come to gloat, have you?" "Came because you asked to see me," Maeve said. "Didn't come to gloat. Didn't need to. You did that work all on your own. The moment you decided a whole ledger full of drafted women was safe just because you'd insulted the one person clever enough to notice it." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "You'll pay for this. A man like me has friends, connection, people who had," Vance corrected, stepping forward, his voice flat and final, "had friends and connections. Most of them are in custody alongside you, or will be soon enough. Given what's written in that ledger," Ezekiel's eyes flicked between the four of them. Calculation still running somewhere behind the bitterness, even locked behind bars with a federal trial waiting for him. "You think you've won something," he said to Maeve. "You think three men buying your contract and putting a rifle in your hands makes you something other than what you've always been. A big homely girl nobody ever wanted for anything but labor." Maeve looked at him a long moment and felt to her own quiet surprise that his words no longer carried the weight they once had. They landed somewhere shallow now, unable to find purchase in the places they used to cut deepest. "You know what I think, Ezekiel," she said. "I think you spent your whole career sizing women up by the same measure you tried to size me up with. What we're worth, what we can carry, what we'll bring at auction. And the one time that measure failed you, the one time a woman you'd already dismissed turned out to be paying closer attention than you ever gave her credit for. It cost you everything." "That's a fine speech," Ezekiel sneered. "Won't change what you are." "No," Maeve agreed, "it won't. I'll still be exactly what I've always been. Just now I know it for myself, instead of waiting on men like you to tell me. That's the difference. That's the whole difference. And it's more than you'll ever understand from behind those bars." She turned and walked out without waiting for his response. And Vance, Kellen, and Bram followed close behind, none of them sparing Ezekiel a backward glance. Outside, the morning had turned bright and clear, the kind of sharp winter sunlight that made the whole world look freshly made. Marshal Higgins stood waiting near a burning barrel set up in the town square. A small crowd gathered around it, drawn by word of what had happened, curious to see the aftermath of a trafficking ring unraveled by a woman half the county had heard insulted only weeks before. Maeve reached into her coat and pulled out the last piece of her old life still weighing on her, the original mail-order contract, the paper her family had signed away with her name on it, the document that had first set her on the road to Deadwood and everything that came after. She held it a moment, looking at the ink, at her own name written in a clerk's careful hand, at the terms that had once defined the whole of her worth in dollars and labor. Then she dropped it into the flames. The paper caught fast, curling black at the edges before it crumbled entirely into ash. Carried up and away on the rising heat, Maeve watched it burn until nothing remained, and felt something settle into place inside her that had been unsettled since the day the coach first pulled out of her hometown, all those months ago. How's it feel? Bram asked, coming up beside her. Like I finally get to decide what I'm worth, Maeve said, instead of some clerk's ledger deciding it for me. She turned from the fire and looked at the three of them. Vance, still favoring his healing shoulder. Kalen, with sawdust perpetually caught somewhere in his cuffs. Bram, grinning, like the whole world had just gotten a little brighter. None of them had ever once, across the whole strange winter, made her feel like a burden or a bargain. They'd made her feel like exactly what Vance had told her on that icy trail all those weeks back. A fortress, not something to apologize for, something built to last. So, Vance said, what now? Maeve considered the question, turning it over slow, weighing the shape of a life that finally belonged to her to decide. Now, she said, I suppose we go home, fix those windows properly this time, and figure out what a marriage looks like between four people who never once needed a paper contract to know what they meant to each other. Kalen's mouth curved into something warm. That's a fine plan. It's not a plan, Maeve said. It's a promise. There's a difference, and I intend to make sure all three of you understand it plain. Starting today, they rode out of town together that afternoon, back toward the mountain and the cabin waiting for them. Windows patched, hearth still warm, a life built not on ownership or obligation, but on the kind of equal respect that had taken root slow and steady across one hard winter. Behind them, the ashes of an old contract scattered on the wind. Ahead, a mountain, a home, and a family built entirely on their own terms. The dawn that met them at the trailhead carried no shackles in it at all, just four riders, and the wide open sky above them, and a whole unwritten life waiting on the other side of the climb. And so, as the last traces of winter disappeared from the mountains, Maeve finally understood that freedom was not something another person could simply hand to her. It was something she had to choose, defend, and sometimes fight for with every ounce of courage she possessed. Ezekiel had tried to control her through fear. He believed that if he took away her choices, isolated her from anyone who might help, and convinced her that she was powerless, she would eventually surrender. But he underestimated the strength of a woman who had finally realized that she had nothing left to lose except the chains around her heart. Maeve's journey reminds us that courage does not always look like a fearless gunslinger standing beneath the noonday sun. Sometimes, courage is a trembling hand refusing to release the truth. Sometimes, it is a frightened voice saying no after years of silence. And sometimes, it is simply taking one more step through the storm when the road ahead cannot yet be seen. Maeve was afraid, but she moved forward anyway. That is what made her brave. Vance's role in her story also carries an important lesson. He did not rescue Maeve by taking control of her life or making every decision for her. Instead, he stood beside her while she found the strength to save herself. Real love does not demand obedience, erase another person's identity, or disguise possession as protection. Real love creates a place where both people can stand as equals. It offers safety without building another cage. Vance understood that Maeve did not need a new master. She needed someone who respected her voice, believed her truth, and remained beside her when the consequences came riding over the mountain. The stolen ledger represented more than evidence of Ezekiel's crimes. It represented the truth that powerful men often believe they can bury forever. But the truth has a way of surviving. It waits in hidden pages, in forgotten witnesses, and in the hearts of people who refuse to remain silent. Ezekiel's downfall reminds us that cruelty may rule for a time, but fear is a fragile foundation. A life built upon lies, greed, and the suffering of others will eventually collapse beneath its own weight. This story also teaches us that survival is not the end of a wounded person's journey. After danger passes, there are still scars to face, trust to rebuild, and a future to imagine. Healing does not happen in a single heroic moment. It happens slowly in quiet mornings, honest conversations, small acts of kindness, and the decision to believe that tomorrow can be different from yesterday. Maeve's greatest victory was not merely escaping Ezekiel. It was refusing to let what he had done determine the woman she would become. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of this Western tale. Our past may shape us, but it does not have the right to own us. The people who hurt us do not get to write the final chapter of our lives. No matter how cold the winter has been, no matter how lonely the trail has felt, there is always a moment when we can turn toward a different horizon. Maeve entered the mountains believing she was running for her life. She left them knowing she was finally living it. And in the end, she discovered that home was not a place where someone claimed her. Home was the place where she could speak without fear, love without surrendering herself, and face the sunrise as a free woman. Thank you for staying with Maeve and Vance until the end of their journey. Tell us in the comments which moment touched you most and what lesson you will carry from their story. And if you believe courage can change even the darkest destiny, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for another unforgettable story from the American frontier. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.